It's Make It Month 3 and today we're going to be looking at doming. So we're going to be looking at the doming block, or the dapping block as it sometimes gets called, and the corresponding punches. Now, doming and dapping, I think, I might be wrong on this so feel free to correct me, is the difference between the American phrasing and the UK phrasing. So I've always called this a doming block and doming punches, but like I say, depending on where you buy it from, it's not unusual for it to be referred to as a dapping block. It tends to be a steel block, but you can also get them in brass and wood and other materials, plastic, with various domed recesses out of it. And what you do is you take your little shape, the corresponding punch, and you hammer it into the recess, into the domed recess, and it's going to take on that curve. So I'm going to have a little go with these. If you remember back to Make It Month 1, we were working with 0.5mm sheet metal. This is a piece of brass. And we were cutting out basic geometric shapes using snips. I have a pair of those. And hammer texturing them just to add a little bit of interest, and then popping a hole in them as well, either using the hole punch pliers or a drill or even just a nail, and refer back to those videos if you want to see the various ways that we did it. But once you have your little shapes, if you want to add more interest, this is where this bad boy can come into it. So if you have something that's textured, you could put a little bit of masking tape on the surface just to protect it a little bit, but I'm going to go straight into the dome. And what you need to decide is, do you want the texture domed outwards like that, or domed inwards? I've decided I want the texture to be domed inwards, a little cup shape with the texture sort of hidden away in that dome. Now what's important is I start in a recess that's considerably bigger than my shape, but that is a lot bigger, so I think I can get away with going a little bit smaller. You spend half the time trying to figure out which way to flip it like a Rubik's Cube to find the right dome. So let's see this one. Okay, that looks pretty good to me. And then the next thing I want to do is find the corresponding punch. Now you can see these are a little bit rusty because, as some of you know, I've just insulated my shed, but prior to doing that I was getting a lot of condensation, so I still need to find time to go through and de-rust all my tools. I'll use some wire wool and some WD-40 to look after them, but just bear in mind that's the downside of steel, is that you do have to look after it. But what I'm going to get is a punch that's nice and big but fits in the recess with a little gap. Got my doming punch. I'm going to place it into the recess where my shape is. I'm going to take my rawhide mallet, or you could use a large metal hammer, and I'm just going to tap it. And what that does is it starts to make the little shape take on the curve of the dome, and then it's up to you. You can keep, depending on how domed you want it, you can keep working your way down. Like so. I'm going to do the same on the other one, starting large again. So you saw how quick and easy it was for me to form this little dome. That was partly because I started in a recess that was considerably bigger than my shape, and it was partly because I used a punch that was bigger than my piece of metal as well. Some of the cheaper doming sets that you can get, they only come with very small punches, so you can form with a small punch, but it just means, if I pop this up here, that you have to sort of work your way around at lots of different angles to get the form into position. Whereas if you can use a larger punch and hit it, it will automatically be forming all sides of your metal in one go. Where it can get a bit tricky is when people try and shove something that's almost the same size as the doming block into the recess, which I'm going to show you now. So I have a piece of metal that's almost the same circumference as the largest dome in my doming block. So I'm going to pop it in there. I'm going to take a big punch maybe not that big. Take this one and give it a hammer. There we go. And can you see, because I've forced it into something that is almost the same circumference as, it doesn't like it, and it's started to buckle and warp at the edges. So to make forms that are almost the same size as your doming block is much, much trickier. And I would now need to sort of hammer those little wobbly bits out. That's why it's always better to ease your shape into the block, starting bigger than the metal, and then work your way up. If I pop it back in, because although it was almost the size, it was a little bit smaller, and persevere, I'm going to go down to a slightly smaller punch, and I'm going to focus on those crinkly edges. You can see it's starting to smooth out a little bit. So obviously it still would need a lot more work to get it nice and smooth, but it is starting to go. But if you can, like I say, ease it into the shape rather than forcing it down, you won't end up with these crinkly, wibbly wobbly edges, and you'll make life a lot easier for yourself. The other thing is, as you notice when I'm hammering on here, it's because it's at the end of the table and I'm trying to get it in shot. Ideally, I would be doing this on a great big book, like the keep the noise down. The other thing you can do is take a piece of metal that's purposely far too big for the recess that you're trying to punch it into, and just go for it anyway. So if I take this punch, my hammer, there you go, and as you can see, it's starting to form, it's starting to bulge out from that sheet metal. But if I keep going, it will start to go further. But in an ideal world, I would have wanted to have softened this metal and eased it into the shape. So as you can see, because my metal was fairly soft, it's taken that form quite well. It has buckled at the edges, but the reason for that mostly is because the diameter of the dome, the recess that I put in, was close to the diameter of the metal, so it didn't have the support around there. But if I had a bigger bit of metal and stayed with the same size dome in the middle and made sure the metal was as soft as it could be, this shape would have pushed down into it without these buckled edges. Now, a lot of you have probably found already over the past couple of months, if you've been following along with the project, that when you hammer your metal, it begins to become quite hard. It's called work hardening. So everything just gets a bit hard and tough and difficult to work with. And if you keep pushing it, eventually it would just crack or snap. And if I keep pushing this, that's what would happen. The reason these little ones formed so nicely and easily was because I eased them into the dome. So I started in a dome shape that was a lot bigger than those little circles, and I eased it into it rather than forcing it all in one go. But either way, like I say, if you can work with metal that's lovely and soft, it's going to form and shape a lot easier, and you don't run the risk of it snapping in half or cracking when you're working with it. So this month we're also going to be looking at what's called annealing. So it's a way of softening your metal. We use a blowtorch to do it, so it's going to be a really nice introduction to the blowtorch before we move on to soldering next month, which is the exciting bit. So the other thing, you can do the forming this month with the tools that we've already discussed, but it's a really good idea to get a blowtorch because that's what leads on to the exciting bit further down the line.